Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I am going to do a bit of a deep dive into the sort of coaching situation specific to community sports coaching. Kind of pulling on some of the findings from my PhD research, sort of maybe elaborating on a little bit and to kind of speculate on what could be gleaned from that is food for thought, not just for individual coaches, the teams, the coaching teams that those individual coaches exist within, to even wider club structures within the community sports setting, and even at the NGB level, because it's all part of an ecological system, and it all influences one another. Or certainly that has been the sort of story, that narrative that I think has came out of the case study research that I've done. So I want to kind of chat through some of that, and do so as always with a bit of an implication for what it means for the coach created motivational environment. So insofar as how well it then, as a result of the lack of structure, I want to say that for a start, because it does seem to be a common theme, that, and I wouldn't just take that from the coaches with and looked at, but just coaches outside of academia that I've worked at as a coach educator, as a coach tutor, and also just my own experience as well. Just once upon a time, most of my experience primarily has been within academy settings, but certainly having worked in with councils and all these sorts of things, and some of these problems certainly do seem to be, ubiquitous, I feel. And I think I can take that also from gathering the thoughts of lots of other people that do their best in a very tough setting to coach in. So we're going to chat a little bit about that and get into that and offer some solutions, perhaps, at the very least, hopefully get people reflecting across the various actors that I've mentioned already. So again, if you are new to the podcast, welcome. Please make sure that you subscribe. Go and check out some previous episodes. I'm starting to try and build my episodes on top of one another somewhat. They can be looked at individually, but there's often going to be overlapping topics, and therefore I do a bit of a deeper dive on some select topic that I haven't had been able to give as much space to. Today, for example, in prior episodes I have done, so, go and check them out and see what you like, and also check out some of the guest interviews as well on various topics that the podcast is also cognizant of. If you're a continued listener, brilliant. Hopefully you have subscribed already. Hopefully you can pass on the podcast to other coaches, even just one other coach that would be brilliant, just to know that help its reach. And obviously check out the links within the show notes, whether it be to my website. You can find further resources that might interest you, as well as the newsletter that you can sign up for as well if you're interested in learning a bit more about motivational psychology specifically. Enough about me. Let's get into the topics. Community sport coaches. These are, and this across football, rugby, tennis, whatever you name it. They're fairly, in my view, they're fairly haphazardous environments, potentially difficult environments to work in. And I think that comes just through the natural diversity of them. And the natural diversity of them is probably built upon the fact that they're grassroots. Therefore, you're going to see various makeups and club structures. Some community clubs are a team working with a age group, whereas others are like massive clubs with quite big infrastructure, where they've got multiple age groups, multiple people managing those age groups with various levels of experience that can complement one another, versus that single group that can often act in isolation, and it's necessary, because otherwise they wouldn't exist at all. And again, organised sport is so reliant on people giving up their time, and that's another thing. The characteristic of the actual coaches working in this space, they're volunteers. They're often, it's a call of to duty, and they aren't necessarily interested in pursuing coaching as a professional career, at least not when they get into it. So they might not have a background in coaching, perhaps anything outside of just having played the game, perhaps. Some of them don't. Normally parents who are busy lives, they're just wanting to help their children, to also maybe people that at an amateur level, we're working with older players, perhaps, that again are just maybe been roped into a little bit, or again do just want to do good. But again, it just speaks to the demographic is quite varied, and again that matters, because you have fairly sensitive needs as a result of that. So I think how we tackle this has to be at a wider level, and understanding the systemic issues that can occur, but also at the individual level, to understand how coaches can help themselves, and how we can arm them with that, and how coaches as a community can make, can be the sum of their parts, and sort of understand how they can be that support together. This is why it is quite difficult, and this is certainly isn't having a go at any one actor in that equation. Like I say, I think everyone has to take some level of responsibility, and it's a cultural thing as well. Some of the stuff that I'm going to get into here as well. So I just want that's my kind of take on, it is a bit of a jungle community sport. So the prime issue, one of the main issues that I'm going to cover strictly this particular issue is structure, or the lack thereof. Structure can be defined in two ways for this conversation. So the structure insofar as like coaches actually having session content. Let's think about particularly the new coach. Obviously, as experience is gained, they become a bit better at that. But we're speaking to the coach maybe that's just started, or indeed maybe the coach that has been around a while, but have never necessarily had that oversight on their coaching and mentorship on their coaching. So it becomes still quite a bit about heuristics, about doing what they can do and with the resources they've got, which again can be quite coincidental around the actual utility of that for good outcomes. Sometimes that works out well, sometimes it really doesn't. So the structure insofar as looking at what we coach. Okay, the actual coaches not necessarily know what to do in the community. And then the structure insofar as the coach is a performer and as someone who requires psychological needs support in their own right and in the lens of the structure by others, by their environment, their certain environment, so they have a sense of how to engage with coaching, the task of coaching well, and they sort of play on themselves somewhat, and we'll, as I'll get back onto, and that therefore is going to have an impact on their perception of competence, which has a resulting impact on how confident they feel about actually coaching, the anxiety, the emotions that they might carry with them into their coaching practice, actually the quality of their motivation to continue to coach, if they even do continue to coach. So we need to look at structure both for actually what we're putting on for the players and what we're delivering to the players, and there's maybe an issue there, I'm going to argue, but also the structure for how coaches are able to perform within their roles as performers in their own right. The actors that have something to do with this, as I say, are the coaches themselves, also the surrounding club. And that can be both a team, but also the teams together accumulatively, how they work with one another. And then there's the national governing body, in terms of like formal coach education and maybe regional work per se there as well. So let's take lack of session content as one. Is it firstly okay, and we'll do a bit of a dive into that so I can zoom in on this topic. So what I've typically found, coaches just don't have enough, or at least they perceive that they don't necessarily know what to coach, and that is somewhat brought on by the fact that they have low experience, so that literally they're going in empty. But maybe it also cannot be helped where they sometimes go in and there isn't really a lot of structure given by the club around them, insofar as maybe like resource packs. But again, who takes responsibility for that? That itself is problematic, or it can just be maybe the lack of training that they've received, or lack of training that they've engaged with as well. Again, it's sometimes there's one thing giving coaches the opportunity, but are they motivated at that time to go and take that opportunity up? Certainly, I know that there's some coaches that go into formal coach education and they do it as purely a box ticking exercise, and they've even divvied up, well, if I've got this badge and you get that badge, then together that means we fulfill the regulations, so that's enough. You're dealing with a mindset there that can be quite tough. So again, as I say, this isn't an NGB bash by any chance, by any means. So you're just in terms of dealing again with the person, because they've got jobs and other commitments and stuff like that. So so that really does matter. What often does occur, however, therefore, is that because there's a lack of session content, coaches go and source it. They need to take it from somewhere, and if it's not within the local environment, it's not given, in a top-down manner from the NGB. Where do they go? Well, online is often the first place that they might start to look, and that is a trend within coaching more widely. That a lot of coaches are using the digital world as a tool, and it can be really useful. However, there are problems, because problems both in how coaching is represented digitally, and problems about what the preoccupation about content, which is what proliferates most of the online coaching resource, because it's probably because it's a product and it's commercialized, and therefore it's like a thing that's sold in that way. And it's most tangible as coaching. The most tangible product of coaching you can sell is the drill or the exercise. So let's think a little bit about what that does insofar as the mindset of a coach that's assimilating that information. Firstly, coaching becomes, I think, overly obsessed with perfection and overly obsessed with the reproduction of content online perfectly, bearing in mind that the content online is often need to be transferred, either because into the coach's own space, because you might go onto YouTube and you find an under 12 drill and exercise maybe for, older, certainly older kids, and you get coaches who are trying to make that work, and they would sometimes don't know any better, and they try to make it work, through no fault of their own, just because experience that matters or something. So if you don't have it, that's tough. We need to develop that critical lens over time, and actually not just through experience alone, but through quality experience, through reflection, and having the help of others. But if I go and take that and I try and use it with an under six team, there's a risk that that the exercise itself isn't actually appropriate, and you maybe aren't skilled enough to scaffold it adequately. So therefore, we're actually reducing the learning opportunities within the exercise for the players that it's used on, but also insofar as like this sort of obsession with very good, perfect coaching, because that's how coaching looks online. It looks seamless because the video that's recorded, they're not going to show a 16-minute clip of the coach doing the same exercise over a period of weeks and getting progressively better at it. They're going to show the coach doing it one time in a 2-minute video where it's seamless, where the players are moving where they want, where the organisation looks flawless. And a new coach, particularly, is going to look at that and go, well, that's the goalpost. This is what I'm trying to get at. So what often happens is then when they actually go and try and do the coaching sessions, they care so much about the content and what they coach that they forget about how they coach it and who they're working with. So the interpersonal element of coaching kind of becomes a secondary function. So actually what I've seen and what certainly I've observed in my own research is coaches become, and they've told me so, that they care more about running the drill and getting the drill going, because the drill is seen as coaching, and it's to them that the highest indicator of their effectiveness and their worth within that role. So certain things in come to the motivational environment, certain things start to occur. So they'll become far more instructive. There's less athlete input because they need to get the drill looking the way it looks in order for it to be good. In their minds, it becomes more directive, and as a result, other controlling methods start to take place within that as well, where we actually start to use like the lure of tangible rewards, whether it be maybe a game at the end, um, as a means to sort of coach compliance, or even indeed threatening punishment if players aren't listening properly, because I'm trying to organise this exercise. The exercise means everything. So we start to see, that actually seep into how we work with players. That can happen. Also as a result of that, because you're so busy, you're setting up the cones and the drills, and by the way, this is good. This is good intended effort that's misdirected by leaving out the interpersonal, or at least putting that as a secondary luxury item. But a lot of coaches I then see is that they're so occupied then about organising the drill, getting it running, that a wee kid coming up to you and wanting to chat to you, you won't have as much time for that. You maybe also won't have as much patience for players talking to one another. So that sense of relatedness is going to go down as well, because that interpersonal involvement with the players, if it's not instrumental to getting the practice up and running, and then transitioning between practices and getting all these other practices in, because how many practices you do and the quality of the practices becomes really contingent for the coach, and so far as how well they feel the session went. So you're actually losing opportunities there for players to gain an element of trust and understand that the environment cares for them by you being caring towards them in an overt sense, by allowing them to also cultivate that sense of belonging with their teammates, because you're not necessarily as easy peasy sometimes with the amount of chatter that's going on while you're trying to get the exercises starting. So these sorts of things start to happen. So that to me is a big issue, because coaching is in the relationship. If you go back to even an episode that I've done with Sophia Duet, we discussed coaching as a relational practice, and it's actually a combination of technical sport-specific teaching and coaching with the relationship work that's done to aid those things, but also seen as its own separate aim as well, because you need to work with people to unlock their potential and for them to feel safe, to then take risks, that you need to develop the person and their independence. So like we talked about autonomous support being really important, but if I'm so preoccupied with getting these drills because that's what I've taken from YouTube, and I'm really worrying about how well I'm going to match up to that mirror image of what I want to be, but aren't there yet, or can never be there, to be honest, because it's so saturated. It's got the Instagram filter, if you want to even use that sort of terminology, but it's not very obvious to these coaches to discern that we see all these seepages happening for the coach created motivational environment as a result. So what do we actually do with that? What's the solution to that? Well, clubs offering sample packs, maybe for new teams that are coming into their setup. If it's indeed a club that has the opportunity to do that, it can be really helpful. But again, it is then who takes responsibility for making the resources, because community clubs are often made up of communities, coaches who are all volunteers. So it's all becomes this thing. And I'm going to come back to this as well, because that's probably going to exacerbate another issue about sometimes the effective lack of structure on the support that coaching teams give to one another, which sort of develops in a sort of cyclical way, this whole thing happening and feeding into itself. But that can be a very useful way of doing it. Just here's some starter guides, just some stuff to get you, just it makes you feel good and makes you just get going with it. But that can be that. Also sort of informal mentors, people that have been there longer than others, if they can lend a hand to give ideas, and that's partly because insofar as how clubs can help themselves and coaching teams can help themselves, that community of practice is a really important aim, in that it's allowing us to get better at the job, and we're supporting each other where we're at each individual day, and managing these milestones and the stuff that comes between them that's often really chaotic in our heads, and we need help and support and reassurance as a result. So but that's really hard to do, because let's think about this, and it's certainly in the situation where there's a club can be made up of multiple teams. If each of those teams doesn't have the required structure, then they also can't help one another, because they're too busy. If I'm worrying about what I'm going to put on for my under eights, I don't have the bandwidth, or even even the desire, to be honest, at that stage, to go and think about how I'm going to help the under 11s understand things. I'm too occupied with what's going on with me and us and our little sort of island, if you will. And this is the bad thing: is so many clubs seem like separate islands, within the one region and really the one community, and it doesn't. But that isn't the lived experience, because we're drowning. Coaches are drowning sometimes, and they're really struggling, so they're just preoccupied. They can't help. You can't help others sometimes until you're able to help yourself. So that's a real hazard. Also, like, and this is quite a unique thing, and it's something to speculate on. This isn't necessarily something that I'm pitching as a solution, but just to give us an example of how wider policy and just the way the wider world and society is working, you know, how these things all kind of interloop. I can't get necessarily the under 15s and O's and 10s together to create this really harmonious sort of stream of, like, I'll help you, you're coming up in age group soon, or you guys are moving to under 7s soon, I've been there before, this is what I do, or have you thought about this? I can't actually maybe get that to occur, because physically, within in the way that a lot of community sport operates, is they're relying on public facilities and booking them, and it is very difficult, near impossible, for multiple teams within any one individual club to get bookings on parks, like local council parks, for example, together at the same time, where they can look across and observe what each other's doing, or even back to back, so that they can kind of feed into one another. That doesn't happen easily. That's a very hard thing to do, because there's so many other clubs also wanting that space at that time of night during the week, when all these other clubs, are each all operating. And so oftentimes clubs are all training, the teams within any one club are training at different locations. So, like, we're separated physically as well. So we're not just separated by the fact that we're busy and the fact that we're trying to just figure out our own problems, but we're separated by the fact that we're physically separated from one another. And that just also exacerbates the problem, and it perpetuates the problem as well. So it does kind of feed into itself in some way in that light. And that's where, if a club can reflect on how it can manage to get people closer together, then that can be a real help. But this is where your counsellor needs to come in, probably. And this is where sport policy and how we actually, and facilities, are we actually building enough facilities to enable these sorts of communities to form as well. So obviously NGBs can do something there as well to offset that, but it's something maybe an NGB, if you're a coach that's listening from a national governing body, to consider that, because it might be one thing saying help each other, but are you conscious of the physical positioning of coaching teams to one another, and how the layout of the land works within community sport to help or just further weaken the process that you're preaching? So it's just something to think about. Another thing that I would like to get into at this point um is about mindset as well, because like I've said, they're looking online, they're looking at content. They're also fascinated often by drills, and this is sometimes a product of being a new coach, because it's the most class, particularly when you come into coaching from outside of sport, or maybe with limited experience of coaching, even if you've been in sport. But we do sometimes look at drills as being the traditional way of what what constitutes coaching. But people that have been in coaching for a while start to sort of graduate out of that, I think, provided they've had a good education, I feel, to start to understand that drills is a learning tool isn't actually all that great, that they have some utility, and they certainly, like, they do have utility. Good drills are good in my view, but game-based learning is a really important new approach to coaching, or at least a really overlooked approach to coaching, where not it's necessarily a product of the modern age of coaching is another thing. I don't necessarily think that is the case. Probably old wine, new labels, but or old wine, new bottles. But there is something to getting coaches to actually stop viewing games as an incentive, but actually instead view games as a learning tool in themselves. And that could take a lot of pressure off, because if we can get coaches to recognise to be more facilitative in their coaching through game-based approaches to coaching, one, they're easier to organise. Two, they can be easier to set up. I'm not saying they're easier to coach, because it does lend its own problem that you then have a lot more moving parts because they're innately dynamic. But while coaches are learning and finding their feet on that side of it and developing their sport specific knowledge, they do allow a lot of knowledge to cultivate naturally, which just even giving coaches that knowledge, and if you are one of those coaches that hadn't thought about this, just think about it. It takes the pressure off of you a little bit. And as a result of that, frees up your bandwidth to then focus on some of the interpersonal elements of coaching that now maybe can come into view a little bit more, to start having more of an opportunity for your players to have input and to make some choices and decisions within the exercise, or even the design of exercises, or those sorts of things, to care a little bit more about focusing on encouragement during the practice, not thinking so much about, these really difficult. And I say it from my experience. I always struggled with drills. They're so complicated, and often they're made to be. But take the view of minimalism, and that's what game-based approaches to coaching help with. But get a really simple game up and running. Then it takes away that pressure of needing to think so much about the organising and the running of the game versus the actual coaching and viewing things and encouragement, and having those that dialogue with players when you need to within it. And again, dialogue doesn't need to be necessarily even sport specific. I gave that example of just talking to players more and just cultivating relationships during the time that you have with them, for however long that is, having the conversations to build that relatedness with them. So it frees it up. Now that does require, however, so it's a solution, and I think it's a very useful solution. But it does require a mindset shift. Now, coaches therefore have to then sort of be taught about that. Now, that maybe comes from the mentor. It comes from other teams in the club. If the club has other teams, it comes from the NGBs facilitating that sort of learning as well. Now, I'm not going to pretend that any sort of local source of help here necessarily has all the answers for how to adequately, as I say, support the free psychological needs like autonomy, competence, relatedness. I think competence, relatedness, well, sometimes been underlooked for actually the amount of technical work that has to be done within that. But a lot of coaches can get onto that, and probably a lot of community actors can help with that quicker than, per se, a coach that's been there longer than you, but being able to tell you a little bit about being a autonomous supportive. That is quite a niche sort of learning there that maybe has to come from formal coach education, just because it's not obvious and not always thought about. So coach education, however, has to be pragmatic and understanding that part of shifting the paradigm of thought towards one that's more about coaching as an interpersonal act, at least part interpersonal and part sport specific, is sometimes about meeting coaches where they're at. So if I advertise as an NGB a workshop around motivationally adaptive coaching practices, is that new coach or the coaches wanting the community going to be more likely to go to that than they are the one that's just about content? No. They're not, because they don't understand that that's important. So the key should be, how can we design content heavy formal coach education courses that embed the interpersonal within it? So we aren't just showing a practice, but we're showing the options for how to support autonomy within the practice. We're showing the considerations for competence support within the practice. We're showing considerations for relatedness support within the practice. So it's like, how can we kill two birds with one stone? We'll meet the coaches where they're at, but can we start to bed in these other things and really champion them in their own right as coaching targets? So make sure that there's a real balance in that there of the session content being one target and getting stuff on and getting the session running, but considering how we coach the session and considering how we meet who we coach within the session, so that the what meets the how and the why. Because right now, coach education is probably too pitched towards the what you do, and that probably in response to what coaching in the community need, but it feeds into this obsession with it. If it is present, that support is present, and in its absence, it's we know that coaches are generating a habit towards the what sort, sorry, the content based stuff. So it can be as a solution, but it can also be as a problem avoidance. If we can get an early enough that we develop that sort of multi-pronged approach in view of coaching. So that's something that I think is helpful to maybe consider. The other issue here is that coaching teams, actually how we support each other within our individual teams, and this could be just for a club that is made of just one team, or the club that, as I say, is maybe working a little bit across it. But this is a little bit more probably about the actual teams within each, or the 3 or 4 coaches taking the wee boy or wee girl's team, not thinking so much right now about, I will come back to you, we are thinking a little bit still about how they're influenced by the wider club structure and the people within it, but certainly let's just focus mostly here on the coaching team, as in the actual, individual team, or the under 8s team versus the under those team, that sort of thing. Coaches are really shy, I think, about supporting with administrative duties. Therefore, it often gets lumped onto one person, and it's sometimes deceiving, because certainly that person that's just came in, that maybe wants to help out, some people take this on the administrative responsibilities, not always conscious of just how much work there is to it. I mean, if you asked any parent or anyone that's involved at the grassroots level, how much admin are you doing, from organising refs to logging things with the league, to communicating with parents, training's on, training's off, here's the team, managing parents and all these sorts of things, because often what happens is the administrative person almost becomes seen as the lead of the team, as the team's little mini manager, so people come to them first, whereas those that maybe aren't taking on the responsibilities get freed up more. They're still battling the other issues with content and other things, I suppose, but they're getting a different experience from that, and people that are dealt with the administrative stuff, they really can feel burnt out by it and overwhelmed by it. So they might even and if they do continue to coach, their emotions create a more controlled motivation for coaching. And actually, even within a PhD, it was interesting, because interviewing 2 coaches, one who is overwhelmed by the administrative stuff, it was like, I have to keep coaching, because see, if I don't, this is all going to fall apart, because they've learned some stuff so well that it would be very hard. They would at the very least need to be a heavy transition phase to get another coach to pick that up. Um, and if if they left immediately, the jobs they do, the team can't function without them. So like, they're actually coaching through guilt and involvement through guilt, which is a more controlled form of coaching and wouldn't have long term um, benefits, in the same way that versus the other coach that I'll give an example of in some of the case study research, that was like, I actually really like that I can just come in and coach and then leave again. So that's a far more internally driven motivation for coaching. And interestingly, the coach that said that, I mean, there's avoidance tactics as well. It's sometimes, as some coaching teams and members of coaching teams actually just do not understand, and they're just totally ignorant of it and oblivious to how much work is done by the person that's doing the administrative role. Some maybe have experienced it in the past and they're deliberately avoiding it as well. So there's a wee bit of social loafing occurring there as well that can create this issue. And therefore, the motivations is different for the coaches with administrative roles. That might seep into how they then behave within their team and the harmony within the team and helping each other. Because a lot of coaches that I've looked at and spoke to, they also have said that it does reduce the feeling of relatedness among coaching colleagues, because it doesn't feel like you're being cared about by the other coaches, and therefore we all know, and when coaches go in with less psychological support of their own, and they have these more controlled motivations, it actually is apparent more in how they coach the players. It can become more controlling versus more relaxed and all these other things, because again, and let's think twofold here, because they're also then balanced administrative roles with coaching anxieties, life pressures outside of coaching, because they aren't full-time coaching. That's really tough. So what coaching teams that need to do to help themselves, the individual coaches sometimes actually don't necessarily tell people about how much they're struggling. So that individual coach, if that's you, you need to talk to other people that you're coaching with. Coaching teams need to actually work well and collaborate with one another empathetically, and learn to delegate tasks and spread tasks out across the team. So while someone may have responsibility for some administration, it maybe shouldn't be all the administration. So maybe there could be certain roles that are divvied up there. If someone's taking the job for communication, someone taking the jobs for paying the referees, other things like that. So could we just share the load a little bit? Now, we also need mentorship and education around how to do that. Okay. So coming back to what I was saying, could the club mentor be there, an informal club mentor who's maybe done this for 10 plus years already with the other teams? Or if it's not them and maybe it's just a single team operating in isolation, can an NGB come in and educate on that? Should that form part of the curriculums within the formal coach badges? So these are some of the things that I think we need to be conscious of, because it really does create a hard situation. So hopefully you can see there, when we look at all this, the lack of structure, coaching teams are struggling, individuals are struggling. The fact that individuals struggle impacts the team. And we're also seeing that, and therefore teams aren't working together across other teams. We're also seeing now the influence here of the various sources within that problem. At the coach level, maybe we need to open up. At the team level, we need to collaborate more. At the club level, we need to synergize our efforts more and create and cultivate a community. But also at the wider level, at the NGB level, we need to deliver training and support to help people spot the things they maybe aren't even aware about. Even at the policy level and working with councils, they need to be conscious of how the setup of resources within community sport influences the relationships and the dynamics and the behavioural dynamics that occur within it. So it's one thing having a push at a council level to increase physical activity, but are you conscious of who the actors that are organising that, and do they have the resources, the facilities, and also the options for how to build cultures that are healthy? Do we free that up? Now, not any one actor can solve all those problems in isolation. I think this is where there is a national collaboration required here that seeps down, but also probably is built up ways from understanding more about the people on the ground and the problems that they face, and building that into some of these macro level planning as well. So hopefully that's interesting, gets you thinking, guys. If you get any thoughts on anything that I've said there, by all means, please get in touch, and pass it on to anyone you think might be looking for this information. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you.